everybody, welcome to the final session of the British Animal Studies Network sequence that's been taking place over the past few months. As I've said, we are asking you to keep your cameras off and to mute yourselves. We will give ourselves time to answer questions at the end. And can I ask that you put them into the chat as and when you think of the questions, and towards the end of the session, I'll try and pick out a few questions to ask Susan. So just to get us started on, many of you will know this, but for those of you who don't, the British Animal Studies Network, which is the organiser of this meeting, is a meeting point for scholars from the arts, in particular arts, humanities and social sciences, with a particular interest in humans and animals and human-animal relations and representations. We also include members from outside of academia, so artists, writers, poets, but also NGOs. We've had presentations from the RSPB, the RSPCA, from the Dogs Trust, and other organisations have come along. We are occasionally blessed, and I mean that, with the presence of veterinary scientists and animal welfare scientists who, of course, broaden our minds to think about things in other ways. The context, the interest in animals from outside of the natural sciences has been emerging in the past 25 years, and animal studies, or human animal studies, or animal studies in the humanities, these are various terms for it, has emerged as a really important area of approaching both culture and society, but also the question, the increasingly pressing question about humans' relationships with the natural world. To turn to our guest today, who we are delighted to have with us. Susan Richardson first came along to a British Animal Studies Network meeting in 2015, to the meeting Cold Blooded that was held at the University of Cardiff. And it was there that she blew me away by her performance, and I invited her to come the next meeting, which was the spring meeting always held at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, to give a performance, but also to run a workshop. She did these, and both of those encounters, I am delighted to say, are detailed in Susan's fantastic collection, which she will be talking about, and we will be talking about, Words the Turtle Taught Me. If at the end of this session you haven't already bought the session book and you are fancying buying it, I'm going to put a link now into the chat so you can buy it from Susan's website. It's a fantastic collection. It is this collection that got Susan shortlisted for the prestigious Poetry Society's Ted Hughes Award in 2019. And before that, Susan had written other collections: Skin Dancing, Where the Air is Rarefied, and Creatures of the Intertidal Zone. She was also, for 4 years, the resident poet on Radio 4's Saturday Live, and more recently wrote and performed the programme Seals and Selkie Folk, part of Radio 3's Slow radio series, which is available on the iPlayer and is just fantastic. Listen with headphones, the sounds are beautiful. She became our poet in residence at the British Animal Studies Network in 2017, and each year she's been writing a poem especially for and on the topic of our meeting, which has been a real honour. She's currently working on a top secret project, which she'll be able to tell us more about if she feels like it, or if she doesn't, she won't, but it's going to be happening and it's going to be very, very exciting. So we are absolutely delighted that even though we can't meet in person, we're able to be together on screen like this. So I want to start by going back to Words the Turtle Taught Me, Susan. In this collection, and I'll leave you to talk about it in more detail, you begin to talk a bit about your technique, and that's something that I have always been incredibly interested in, is literally, how do writers write? And that is from the what pen do you use? Do you do it on a screen? To what inspires you to write the particular things you are writing? So could you just say a few words about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just contextualize the book a little bit for those who may not have come across it. And basically, Words the Turtle Taught Me came about as a result of a residency that I was very fortunate to have with the Marine Conservation Society, marine conservation charity based in the UK. And several years ago, in their 30th anniversary year, they launched a project called the 30 Threatened Species Project, which was foregrounding 30 endangered species, all of whom appear on the IUCN Red List of threatened species, and all of whom are either resident in or visitors to UK waters. And I was commissioned to write a poem for each of the 30 threatened species, some of them iconic, well-loved, well-known species like the bottlenose dolphin and the Atlantic puffin, others far less well-known and less seen, actually, so inhabit the depths. I think there's the frilled shark, for example, has only been seen 3 times alive, and others who are less well seen because they are actually well on the road to extinction. The angel shark, for example, is extinct now in one of its habitats in the North Sea. So it was quite a challenge, I think, to connect with and engage with some of these creatures. 9 shark species, for example. At the beginning, I was a little bit flummoxed by the fact that I was going to have to write 9 distinctively different poems on sharks. But in terms of the collection, that it contains 30 poems for each of those 30 species, but there is also an extended essay at the back, which you've just alluded to, Erica, which I really wanted to explore, I suppose, the process of the writing of the poems. Look at, my background, I suppose, is almost exclusively arts and languages. So I had to really immerse myself in science, learn quite a lot about the species, speak to marine biologists, do a variety of courses from the practical beach cleaning to otter ecology. So yeah, spent one weekend with my nose buried in otter poo, which was quite an interesting process. So yeah, so there was the scientific side of things that I wanted to explore in the essay. Also think about some of the struggles and challenges. Think about how appropriate poetry is as a vehicle for raising awareness around environmental activism and animals in particular. Can it really make a difference? And also, as you said, as you alluded again, thinking about the writing process. So with each poem, I talk about, I suppose, my decisions, form, structure, and the various poetic techniques that I weave into the various poems as well, from sound patterns, half rhymes, assonance, alliteration, yeah, all of those poetic techniques as well.
So pencil, pen, quill, pen?
Probably first notes, first draft will be handwritten, and then when it gets to a certain stage, it'll shift onto the laptop.
Thank you. That interests me. It really interests me. I mean, can you say a little bit more about the science? Because that is one of the things that comes across in that essay, is exactly that kind of training that you go through. And you are discovering, not just going to Wikipedia to find out about these animals and thinking, oh, okay, it's pretty and it's ugly, or it's grey, it's dark, and so on. That you're actually undertaking clearly scientific based training. How do you use that science to write the poetry, but also how does the poetry, I don't know, work alongside it? How do you do that? What's the relationship for you?
Yeah, I'll give a brief overview of some of the sciencey things that I did. There was, as I said, that otter ecology weekend, which involved yeah, tracking otters actually, and ended up not seeing any. But actually found a lot of pleasure in the not seeing and just finding otter signs, such as the otter spraint, the otter poo, and places where they rest up during the day. So it was really quite exciting to discover otter signs, and it didn't really matter that we weren't actually spotting otters. So yeah, that was quite interesting, the otter ecology course. I decided I was going to commit to doing a weekly or twice weekly beach clean on my local stretch of beach in Pembrokeshire, and ended up sort of liaising with Keep Wales Tidy and became a litter champion, which sounds a lot more grand than it really is. It's basically about committing to doing the beach cleans and then spreading the word as much as possible online and so on. And I think the marine debris issue really did become, yeah, that shifted very much to the forefront of my mind. And I did end up taking an academic course in that. I think it was jointly run by the Open University of the Netherlands and the UN Environment Programme. And that was, I think that was an 8-week course, and it was, I thought I knew various things about marine debris before I took the course, but that really did blow my mind in terms of the information that I accrued during those 8 weeks. And then there was a cetacean monitoring course called WOW Cetaceans, which the WOW bit actually stands for Wildlife Observer Whales. It's a really felicitous acronym there. And so that involved monitoring bottlenose dolphins, Risso's dolphins, mainly in Cardigan Bay. And those were mostly the practical courses I did. And then it was a question as well of speaking to as many marine biologists and ocean ecologists as possible, really. In terms of how that information then became woven into the poems, it's probably best if I illustrate what I'm going to say with a few poems, perhaps, because I didn't, obviously, once you've got all of these scientific facts, how are you going to make them poetic? And also, how are you going to win people over and engage them with those scientific facts? And one of the first poems that I decided to tackle was the sperm whale. And I felt quite overwhelmed at the prospect of writing about the sperm whale initially, actually, not only because of its huge anatomical size. Some of the facts I learnt included that its heart weighs as much as 2 human men. Its brain is the biggest of any creature on the planet. When it was being hunted for the spermaceti, which is the substance that's found in an organ in the brain, you would get the hunters would tragically get 500 gallons per creature. I think it's got 1/4 mile of intestines. So I was quite overwhelmed, I think, by the anatomical size, and I felt that I wanted to convey the anatomical and biological information. But I was also quite overwhelmed by the cultural size of the sperm whale, because so many others have written about this creature quite brilliantly. I mean, you've not just got Moby Dick, but you've also got Philip Hoare, contemporary writer, writing quite beautifully and brilliantly about his encounters with sperm whales. So in terms of actually portraying this creature, and also the threats. I mean, it was really the threats to the whale's anatomy that I wanted to put across as well. The fact, for example, that when it's or in the process of our drilling for oil and gas reserves, that will cause neurotrauma and cause whales to strand, sperm whales to strand. So it was the threats, really, and the impact on its anatomy that I wanted to put across too. And in terms of where I was going to, what my starting point, I realized that my only personal connection with a sperm whale had come quite a few years before, when I was lucky enough to be traveling in Newfoundland as part of a fellowship. And I stumbled on into a little settlement, and the biggest real focal point in this settlement was the Museum of Whales and Things, which is a real sort of ramshackle, rickety, homespun museum run by a folk artist, an ex-fisherman actually, and now a folk artist. And along with all of the various exhibits that hodgepodge of exhibits that he'd really amassed and put into this shack. There were tidal pool touch tanks and lobster pots and waders and all kinds of unusual fishing gear. He actually had on display the skeleton of a sperm whale. A whale had actually stranded on the coast, is in his environment, quite nearby, I think 3 years previously. And he'd skinned it and removed the flesh, boiled the bones, and then painstakingly assembled the skeleton. And they were suspended, the bones were suspended from the ceiling like enormous wind chimes. It was, and he had a little handwritten note next to it saying "for rent," in case anybody wanted to borrow it and put it in their own little museums. So that was my way in, I think, this whale skeleton. And I started to think that if we as humans were decided that we were going to build a sperm whale of our own, how would we go about it? Would we try and approach it humbly and take into account all of the various threats that the whale is suffering at our hands, or would we simply want to build a more resilient whale that was more able to deal with all the problems that we were throwing at it? And sadly, I think the latter would be the case. So the poem that emerged is called Build. There won't be a manual. Don't expect instructions to be etched as scrimshaw on a tooth. Don't panic flick through Moby Dick. Think benthic. Begin with the insides. Don't try to refine the design. Just bear in mind as you loop and wind its quarter mile of intestines that you'll need to add an enzyme that can form chyme from plastic. Though you'll flail many times waist deep in spermaceti, you must never fail to grin. A frown will rigidify collapsible ribs. A curse could shift blowhole to fin. When straining to start its skiff-sized heart, cling like a giant squid to your task till your will inflicts suction cup marks on its rippling Pacific of skin. Make sure you've got thrash metal blaring as you fill it with clicks and breath, on the off chance that this'll prepare it for decades of drilling and seismic tests. Be ready for the moment when it outknows you, when the weight of its brain takes over and goads you to renovate yourself.
That's one of my favourites, Susan.
I thought I'd put that one in for you.
Thank you, thank you.
And yeah, so that's an example, I suppose, of a poem where I had the scientific facts and so I had the reality, and it became quite surreal with the idea of humans constructing a new sperm whale of their own. So I never felt, or I tried not to feel restricted by the science, but to take it in new, often surreal directions. There are, however, poems in there which are not so rooted in science, and I'll perhaps share an example of one of those as well. It's another whale poem, actually, a much less well-known whale, the sei whale, that's S-E-I, and it's another whale that was tragically almost hunted to extinction in the 19th and 20th centuries at the time of industrial whaling. And I think it's the 9th largest creature on the planet, and it's one of the speediest of the whale species. And I was writing this at a time that I was working on another project around animal communication and speaking with people who believe they have the ability to telepathically communicate with animals. And I went along to one of these workshops myself, and which was a very interesting experience, actually, which I haven't got time to go into at this point, but it was very interesting. And I think as a result of doing that workshop and communicating with a snake, a python, and 2 vultures and quite a number of dogs in the course of the weekend, I started to think about writing a poem that was, not so rooted in science, but much more intuitive and visceral, I suppose. So in this particular poem, Charmed, I create a character who believes she has the ability to summon whales to her from across the ocean. And instead of summoning the whale in order to inflict some form of violence or to hunt or to destroy, she doesn't have that agenda. What is going to happen as a result of this summoning? What is the whale making of it, and what is she going to do at the end of it? So this ended up as a poem called Charmed. She calls him from 1,000 miles distance, sends forth an invisible cord from her edge of cliff to his edge of existence. She calls him in autumn storms, in summer stillness, grooves a new migration route, moons him towards her for tide after tide. Some claim with disdain that she practiced on sprats, Some beg her to tame their cats or mend their lame horses. Others whisper that she's aiming to become one, then hide from her gaze, for upgrading to Rorqual takes whole shores of sorcery compared with subsiding into seal. She knows when he's close by the tingle of krill on her tongue, by the pulse of his infrasonic hum in her thighs, by the unpleating of her throat as she hazards a smile. And though she's tiring, awed by his size, she relies on no lyre to draw him. No piping raises him, swaying from the waves. And when he finally arrives, she ignores the precipice, leans further, further, further over the side to tell him why she fetched him, words stranding between them like baleen. Not to contrive more scientific lies, not for those men rubbing Krona from their eyes, but to show that my kind need not be predators, for no other reason but to see.
That's fantastic, fantastic. This is, as I've said, the final event in a sequence we've been having as part of the British Animal Studies Network under the title Violence. And we've been hearing talks about the violence of agriculture, hate speech and the relationship between kind of the hated human and animals, and some really unpleasant things you can imagine. Your poems in this collection are basically about the most violent violence humans are committing on the planet at this time. And yet they are not violent. I realise that's a choice on your part. So could you talk a bit about why you've made that choice when you're addressing such a massive concern?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you say, the violence is there. It's anthropogenic, really general anthropogenic violence of so many kinds, from toxic pollution to marine debris, climate change, overfishing, habitat destruction. It's all in there. But as you say, direct violence, I tend not to display direct violence in the terms of an agent and a particular creature suffering pain, except in a couple of places perhaps where which I'll talk about. Yeah, I think there are several reasons for this. I think sometimes some of the figures that I was reading about came across as a little abstract, perhaps. So, for example, I would read that the blue shark, 20 million blue sharks die every year as a result of bycatch, and also they are absorbed into the shark fin fishing industry. So, and that's an extraordinary number. It can't possibly be sustainable. And yet it's so hard to comprehend that number, I think. And I feel that the places where I actually write about or portray an episode of violence in a non-abstract, in terms of moving away from the abstract sense of numbers, is really where I've had personal experience of witnessing it, I think. So, for example, as I mentioned, I talked about the fact that I got very deeply involved with the whole marine debris issue. So I monitor grey seal pupping beach in Pembrokeshire, and very, very close to my home. And over the last few years, I've seen many more examples, or an increasing number of examples of grey seals being caught and entangled in lost or abandoned fishing gear. So that's definitely on a rise. And it's very distressing to see that. And because it's a pupping beach, it's actually inaccessible apart from by boat. You can't actually even abseil down the cliffs, and you're not allowed to disturb the pupping beach anyway. You can't rescue one creature because that would cause disturbance to others. So it is quite distressing at times to see, to witness this entanglement. I've also been along to quite a number of seal sanctuaries. There's one in particular in Norfolk, which specialises in not just rescuing lost, abandoned, injured pups, but also rescuing adults who are entangled and have horrific injuries. And on one of the occasions when I went there, I witnessed, or I met a rehabbing seal who 2 months previously had been brought into the sanctuary with a flying ring, a frisbee with a hole in it, lodged around her neck. And the manager said, you know, she sees quite a number of these injuries in a year now, but this one was so bad that when they actually cut the ring off, she thought it was, you know, she actually said she thought the head would fall off because it was so deeply embedded. And I saw the seal in recovery phase, thankfully, but there was another one that had monofilament netting entangled around her neck. So I think the places in the collection where I am showing or manifesting violence most explicitly is because I've seen it myself, I think, rather than because I've read an abstract number. I could read a short first section of a poem which looks at the marine debris issue. It's not actually the grey seal, but it's the leatherback turtle. And it's a two-part poem, actually. I'll just read the first part because it's specifically about creatures tangled in lost and abandoned fishing gear. And with this, it's known as ghost gear. So as I'm sure you all know, and I decided that I would use the ghost of Christmas past. It would become the ghost of fishing past, the ghost of fishing present, the ghost of fishing yet to come. So this is called Net. The ghost of fishing past has failed to fade. It will haunt degradable dreams for decade after leathery decade. The ghost of fishing present is not the one doing the moaning. What you hear is the sound of 1,000 gouged flippers, mangled skin, tangled necks, flexible shells yelling for protection. The ghost of fishing yet to come nets every ocean current and tide. Entire gyres are trapped. Waves writhe and thrash as the sea sinks to the bottom of itself.
Have you ever tried to, I guess, represent a form of violence to animals that you felt was kind of not how you want to write, or not what you think is put in languageable, if you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yes, I would also say one other thing actually about, I want to say something about this portrayal of violence as well before I move on to talk about the poem that, is more explicitly violent, that I did not feel perhaps so comfortable with. But I think one thing that it's possible to do with poetry actually is, it doesn't, I suppose violence doesn't just have to be in the content. It doesn't just have to be in describing a violent scene, but the violence can also be expressed via sound patterns, for example, and form and structure. So there's one poem in Words the Turtle Taught Me where I, to go back to this blue shark who, as I said, 20 million die every year. I decided that the violence would be expressed via sound patterns, and specifically through the use of plosive sounds, so p, b, t, and d, the sounds that explode out of the front of the lips, and guttural sounds, the k and g, that we make in the back of the throat, which I think have quite a harsh, hard, violent feel to them. So even though when I was writing about the blue shark, I wasn't actually expressing violence or writing in terms of the content, hopefully the violence came through in the use of the language and the sounds. And it turned out to be a poem written in the voice of a blue shark, or I suppose the collective voice of blue sharks. And I think what I was really struck by as far as this particular species is concerned is the fact that they are the most extensively studied shark species. We know so much about them. They have been extensively satellite tagged and tracked. We know that the female's skin is 3 centimeters thicker than the male's because the male bites the female during the mating process. We know where they mate, we know where they spawn, we know so much about them. and yet we still allow 20 million of them to die every year. So I think it was that that idea I wanted to explore in the voice, through the voice of the blue shark. Would it be appropriate to read that one, do you think, Erica, or would you? Yeah, okay. So this one is called Watched. Always tagging, always trapping, always cracking the wise when you analyse our sex biting, always viewing our lives through a glass-bottomed heart, always ruining the part you've played in our demise, always bluing the air, always claiming there are 20 million more to spare, always saming and saming, always naming a price for off-sliced fin, always ticking the box next to thicking of skin, always counter-shading, always mounting your panting pages of data, always baiting your breath with blamings and stats, always wording, always herding us into bar charts and grids, always blurting our secrets of squid and a weighing, always saying you're not, always flossing the loss from your teeth, always sleeking with relief that we're still here. Yeah, so hopefully that it came across that even though it's not the content, it's not explicitly showing violence, hopefully the sounds came across as conveying that sense of harshness and violence. But to go, to your question about whether I've ever had to write or been requested to write or wanted to write a poem where violence is much more to the fore. And yes, I can think of an example of that actually, because alongside this really wonderful ongoing residency with the British Animal Studies Network, which is always one of the highlights of the year, I have to say, coming up to Glasgow and so on, it's really such a thrill, it's so enjoyable. But I've also got an ongoing residency with World Animal Day, which is celebrated or marked every year globally on October the 4th. And and apart from the fact that I feel every day should be World Animal Day, it's a great initiative actually, because it raises awareness of the need to improve animal welfare globally, the need to recognise all animals as sentient beings, and it's a way for animal activists across the world to actually network and connect in quite a meaningful way, I think. And so every year I'm asked to write a poem on a particular, usually an animal welfare issue. And a few years ago, I was asked to write about animal testing in laboratories. And it needed to, I was asked to write quite an upfront poem, quite explicit, but not in a, I would say yes, explicit. So not, just putting the facts out there, I suppose. And I found it extraordinarily difficult. It's immersing. Again, it was a subject that I knew something about, but then immersing myself in the research for that was very uncomfortable. I have to say, it was necessary but uncomfortable and important to do it. And then thinking about how I was going to write a poem out of that material was very difficult. It's probably one of the most difficult things I've had to do, I think. It didn't seem appropriate to write in the voice of an animal, or to use myth, or to launch into the surreal, or do any of the things that I might ordinarily do when I was writing, if I was writing, an animal-focused poem. It was, in the end, I just thought that I would try and do something appropriate with the form. So the form has a very claustrophobic, caged kind of feel. So they are short, 4-lined stanzas, each one like a cage. And sound again became quite important. But instead of having sort of half rhymes, assonance, alliteration, I worked quite a lot with full rhymes, which is something that I don't do very much. And again, I suppose it was an attempt to give a sense of not being able to escape from the rhymes, that the rhymes were also caging and trapping. So I will share this poem. I've never read it in public before. It's been circulated. Once it was written, and for World Animal Day, it was circulated widely and so on. And thankfully, they were really happy with it. But it's never been a poem that I'm entirely happy with, and I've never read it in public before, mainly because, well, I'm not that happy with it. It's also not very appropriate outside of this, I think, poetry, animals, violence context. I'm not sure it would be really appropriate to do it. But also, hopefully, it'll be interesting, because I'm always interested to know what other poets feel is working and not working. And I think having poets share what they feel and not their strongest poems as well is really interesting and potentially quite useful. So, so this is called For the 115 Million. Which is a reference to the number of animals that were being used in lab experiments at the time when I wrote it. I'm not sure what the latest figure is, actually. Okay, so this is for the 115 million. Let us recognize the rabbits, blinded for our vanity, and keep in mind the mice groomed for tumors and cocaine. Let us leak chemical tears, and let our skin sear in sympathy with the primates climbing and falling through their forest of tubes and pain. Let us grieve for the unnamed, the unknowns caged in secrecy, killed on account of our craving thick lashes and clean drains. Let us mourn the gentle beagles, bred to be force-fed pesticides, forewarned of their torture by the number tattooed in one ear. Let us refuse to excuse the brains that spurn computer modelling and all humane alternatives to ferrets furred with fear. Let us never forgive the hands injecting and infecting, yet neglecting to raise themselves to volunteer.
Wow. I remember reading that. I remember reading that when it came round, and yeah, wow. It's fantastic. I can see there's a couple of questions come through, so please, people, do think of adding a question to the chat if you want to. Can I go back to a very basic question about poetry, and in particular the kind of poetry you're doing, which is about addressing very specific issues that need to be addressed, which is, what is it that poetry, as opposed to other kinds of writing, as opposed to other kinds of art or representation, what is it that poetry can do?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. And it's something that I grappled with quite a lot during the process of the residency. And yeah, I sort of dipped. I dipped at one point thinking, oh, what on earth is the point of me doing this? Because, you know, there are all these millions of animals dying. What can a poem achieve? What can I do on this very micro level? I was also running workshops, as I mentioned, encouraging people to engage with the issues around marine conservation and species level extinction. And we had to, of course, fill in forms at the beginning and end of the project where people would talk about whether they changed or thought about things differently as a result of the poetry and writing poems themselves and listening to poems. And it was really pleasing to hear that people, you know, some people had pledged to give up single-use plastic and made other commitments in that way. But I still kept thinking, this is on such a micro level, and what we really need is radical policy change. You know, I think it's ocean ecologists talk about the fact that we need 30% of our waters to be protected, and it's less than 1% at the moment. So yeah, so there were times when I was involved in the project when I was absolutely despairing and thinking, what can I do? I was also, I think, aware of the fact that even though I wanted obviously to influence and engage, I didn't want to be overly didactic and overly strident, because that can alienate the audience. Mm-hmm. And often, you know, within the poetry world, there's also often this view expressed that poetry shouldn't even have an agenda. It should just be. And I remember having a discussion with quite a respected poet, actually, who said to me, all we should be doing is bearing witness. We shouldn't be trying to change or influence. We can just bear witness, record what's happening, and that's the limit of it. And I absolutely don't agree with that. I think we're in such a critical time that I can't just bear witness. I have to try and do something with the words that I'm writing. So so those, yeah, I've kind of summed up there the things, some of the despair that I went through, and the doubt that I had over what poetry might not be able to do. But I still actually deep down do believe that poetry has the ability to create new patterns of thought and experience. And in addition to engaging the intellect, it can also engage the emotions, obviously. And I think once the emotions are engaged, that can have a really long, hopefully a really long lasting effect, much more than if it's just, for example, a scientific fact. And I think it can also, I think I got to the point where I felt that I wanted to have fun with the poetry. So there are a number of poems in there where that are quite playful, and in spite of the really the dire subject matter sometimes, taking that semi-playful approach, I hoped would enable me to engage more people, because I think that, again, when I was trying to encourage people to come along to the workshops, some people said, oh no, I don't really want to write about loss. You know, can't we write about what's still abundant instead? So I was having to also get over that idea that people perhaps aren't ready to think about, not everyone is ready to take on board that immense subject of loss and extinction. So how was I going to, I suppose, how was I going to tackle that? So I think one thing I did was try and, with some poems, was to be a bit playful with language and with subject matter, and also to, particularly with some of the species that might have been more difficult to access, to try and create a sense of wonder, and also to perhaps try and find some kind of common ground that we could associate with. So, for example, there's the poor beagle shark, which it's the only shark that's been found to display play tendencies. So it displays the things that we're used to doing, that we are used to, our companion animals to do, that we are used to see dolphins doing. I would bet that quite a number of shark species actually do this as well, but the poor beagle is the only one that's been proved or witnessed actually playing, or apparently playing. So I'll perhaps, before we move on to the questions, I'll end with the poor beagle shark poem, if that's okay, Erica. And so, as well as it having playful subject matter and focusing on this idea of the shark's ability and inclination to play, I also wanted to be playful with language and show that language can also misbehave. So in the poem, nouns act as adjectives, adjectives act as verbs, and verbs are really quite naughty. So I wanted that playfulness of the shark, it's written in the voice of the poor beagle shark, to be reflected in the playfulness of the language. And so I think that's one thing that poetry can hopefully do, engage through a sense of play, even when it's quite a challenging subject. Love being on the cusp of tooth, love quick swim and squidding, love egging little finniness, thousand egging, love best when frondling kelp the under over under roll, and oh the gilly tingle, not just skin ridding, not just snail full, but wrap and tangle, tag and tug, all feely with it. Love sillying the timbers, love snouting the floaters till they pop. Better than sex scar, better than whiffs of flitting sleep, and better than their one-sum funning, the rippy throat, the long strung, and gut gash when they thin we out in thrash of unsea above.
Unsea above is fantastic. The next meeting we're having, again, sadly, is going to be online, and that's Loss, being organised by our colleagues at the University of Birmingham, which is happening in early September. And we hope that the next meeting in Glasgow will be early next May, and it's going to be called Care. Susan is already invited to that, so we hope she'll be there along with lots of other people, and details of that will come out on the website soonish. I think given the time, given the evening, given the world, we should just say thank you so much, Susan. I'm always so proud to have you as our poet in residence. It's just a fantastic thing that we've got you. And I'm delighted you came to that meeting in Cardiff and I found you. And I also clean the beach that Susan cleans because all my family live in West Wales. So I was reading her book and feeling sad that I hadn't been there for a very, very long time. I hope to see you very soon in person on the beach with Hooper.
We will be there. Yeah, absolutely. We'll be there this summer sometime, I'm sure. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for organising it, Erica, as well. It's always a pleasure, always such a pleasure.
Well, it's been lovely to see you, and thank you everybody else for coming along. I'm afraid somebody has just got their hours wrong and they're just trying to join now. That's very sad for them, but thank you everyone for coming. I hope you have a good evening and stay safe. Bye.